Hello, everyone. Welcome to the which number again? Okay, 86th episode of DevKami.
Wow.
And I'm Chilium, and we have two guests today.
Yeah. So I'm swimming. So I used to work with these guys down there, up there, whatever direction we are now. So we have Khairil and of course Michael. Both have worked one way or another on Sina project and all that, which lead to a lot of questions. Whereas Tristan, one may ask, he's busy. He will join us later. So with that said, let's start with events. What we have for events. Even with MCO. Oh, okay. Which is a good thing, despite MCO is official.
It's a good thing because we get used to being lazy after MCO.
Yes. So we're not doing, and it's a good thing because we don't actually know whether the virus are gone for real. So there's that. So that being said, let's go to the news then. So here's an interesting one. So do you remember that Intel and AMD had a collaboration at one point? They had a processor with AMD GPU in it. They killed off the project. So yeah, too bad. Then what else we have? We have we don't have much thing happening. Interestingly, do you have anything on your list?
I'm still handling some of the social media stuff.
Yeah, in short, I don't think we have much thing happening. Yeah,
Well,
it's been a slow day.
In the creative world, GIMP 10.22 is just out. So for those of you doing, so they're getting closer to GIMP 3. So the latest one has non-destructive cropping. It's got
nice.
A couple of cool filters that's usually used for photography, like what do you call it? This kind of Instagram type filters and bokeh, background defocus, and so on. So that's in the latest version of GIMP 2.10.
Nice. Nice.
Ardor 6 is also out if you're doing music production. So that's an open source digital audio workstation. So that's getting pretty good too. So on the creative side, and Blender 2.283. So at least on the creative side on Linux, there's a whole bunch of software.
Obviously, we are not the creative bunch.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's just
Ironically.
amazing. It's just amazing how far Linux has come. Like, I mean,
Yes.
when you look at what Blender is right now, it's got like 2D animation, it's got video editing. And the video editor in Blender is actually almost as good as a full-blown video editor. So, yeah, it's worth checking out these tools.
Oh, but you're
And in
using
fact,
it on Linux and not your BSDs.
No. I don't think that's a sad state
it's
right
an
now.
insider joke. Yeah. It's an inside joke, but Khairil is one of the bigger BSD user among us. So among the tech community. So yeah. Yeah, very interesting. Also, on the Linux creative side, Go.engine also pretty good. It's entirely feasible to do the whole end-to-end game development on Linux right now. It used to be Linux had been a sideshow on running the server farms and all that. Now it's totally feasible to do the whole thing through end-to-end, which is actually interesting and also very underrated. And Parascoot is in. I hope I can see him.
Hello.
Tristan.
Sorry, I'm late.
And yeah, no problem. Turns out that we don't have a news. Any news for us before I go on?
We don't have news, really.
No news is good news.
It's slow news day, apparently.
Oh, did we talk about the Microsoft Go VS Code plugin?
Yeah, it's just a change of ownership.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
still.
So Microsoft used
it's
to
not
be
Microsoft anymore.
it used to be the maintainer of the Golang plugin, but it got absorbed by the Google Golang team. So
Yeah. Which is
So Microsoft going to support Rust fully, right?
Yeah.
replace their C++.
Well,
So
aside from the ownership change, what else are we expecting? Like, will there be more innovation, less innovation? Will they be funded? Will they be
but it's
less
also
funded?
interesting because Golang is a dual hit language, so they do that so that they got people to use VS Code.
It is.
And
I
now
thought
that
Golang
it's
I
a
thought
sign,
Rust is the new hip language.
so with this over, it means that VS Code is a mainstream platform now. That that upstream maintainer willing to support the tool set on top of it.
Mhm.
Yeah,
But that's just my opinion.
and
And
it's a good
if we have
and bad.
nothing, let's go on that.
Yeah.
Yes.
Let's focus
So
on the.
since there's slow news there, yeah, let's go with
Yeah, you're
Khairil
gonna be
then.
the interviewer.
So yes. So Khairil, let's introduce yourself before we go on. And also, yeah, let's start with Khairil, then we go through Michael.
Gotta focus.
Yeah.
Stop laughing at it.
Yes.
It's live.
Okay. I'm Khairil. I'm with the Senior Project, which is in Malaysia, which is a civic tech organization. So it's not, it's an NGO, but it's not like your traditional NGO in the sense that we do a lot of tech related work or things that are involving tech to do NGO type things. Yeah.
Right.
So
So how about Michael? We have
Hi.
more questions about what does it mean by that, but let's introduce Michael.
Yeah, hi.
How do
Mike.
we bring Michael?
We support CNR on the weekends. So nowadays doing some projects for the Parliament docs and State Assembly docs using Golang. But if you want to know anything about freedom of information, do ask. They run around to test the freedom of information enactments in the states in Malaysia.
So, Senior Project is not your full-time job, right?
Oh no,
This is volunteer work.
yeah,
Michael is a
Or
full-time
is it
supporter
your
of
full-time
everything.
job? I don't know.
I
I would like it
he
not
was
to be
full-time.
full-time, but you end up doing it
Yeah.
full-time.
but these days, back to full-time job and Sina has part-time.
Okay.
Yes. So this is more of an interview style, but do you want to show the presentation for this, or let me go through?
No, just
The
go
interview first.
with your questions first. Yeah.
Okay.
Can you play some music?
So explain to.
I heard that was the promise. You're gonna play something live.
I'm not going to do this.
So
Okay.
explain to us what is civic tech in this case.
Okay. So civic tech is usually, I think we've had a long discussion for this in Code for All on exactly what that means. So it means a lot of things to different people, but there was quite a common set of criteria, which is basically tech for the public good. So if you think about government services, so what do we mean by public good? Means that whatever we do is beneficial for everyone and it's accessible freely by everybody. So think of it as more like a public good or a public service. So generally civic tech revolves around that. And a slightly larger area of civic tech now is the fact that because it involves public service, it often includes dealing with government and dealing with bureaucracy and policies and so on. So it's shifted now from, instead of just kind of building apps, to kind of discussing with the government exactly how they should use tools better, or how they can change laws that deliver, like for example, a common complaint with government is that their websites suck, right? That's a common complaint. So part of what dealing with civic tech now is also dealing with governments, like how can they do their procurement policies better, so that if they can hire better developers, for example. So civic tech now involves both the tech, but also kind of the policy and engagement.
Right. Consider that it's a public service. Why don't the government involve, and why the private citizens should do this then? What a counter argument here. Big disclaimer, I was one of the founders of Sina Project. I'm going to pretend that I know nothing.
I know nothing about CETA project,
Yes.
so I can ask anything without bias.
No,
Yes.
but just now, what
Okay,
was your
back to
question again? Yeah, what was your question again?
why should we citizen already paying our tax do whatever these public services in this supposed to be job of the government?
Yeah, aren't you stealing jobs from them?
Well, I mean, this comes back to this same question as, what's the role of civil society, right?
Right.
So you got to think that civic tech is actually civil society. That's why I introduced us. We're an NGO. As such, we behave more like an NGO than as a, let's say a private company or a social enterprise.
Yeah.
So the question comes back to, what is the role of civil society? So basically, civil society's role is basically that space in between government and the private sector. So you're still an organization, but you're filling in the gaps. So it's like why you're filling the gaps of what the government should be doing or what the private sector should be doing. So I think the best way to explain it is in terms of the tech world, right? So what's a kind of civic tech? What's a tech NGO? Linux Foundation is one example. Blender Foundation, we were just discussing about Blender. The USB Standards Group is also an NGO. So here's what I mean by NGO filling a service gap. So if I was Intel and I need to develop a standard, I'm not going to be that friendly with AMD, right? And I'm not going to be that friendly with NVIDIA, for example. But I want to develop this standard. But as Intel or as AMD, I know that if we work together, it's actually better for the industry. So now how am I going to work with this? Now, working with the government also comes with its own set of problems. So if I'm going to do a tech standard by, let's say, the EU or ISO, it's probably going to take me 5 years before that standard comes in place. There'll be a lot of politicking and, and there'll be a lot of non-technical people in these work groups. So you might not want to involve government for, say, a USB standard. So in this case, in this example of a tech civil society, the USB group, if I'm not mistaken, it's USB-IF. They're an NGO and they fill this gap where they're the neutral party in delivering, hiring people to define the standards, hiring people to do the advocacy, doing the promotion of, let's say, USB 3.0 as an example. And the other part is that you need an NGO for these kind of things because it's actually a full-time job. Nobody just develops the USB 3.1 standard as their freelance or part-time job. It's a huge document, requires testing, hardware, and so on. And now, if I'm going back to that use case, if I'm Intel, why would I contribute to my resources to this standard? Why not I just make it proprietary, right? Like what Apple does. But so an NGO here allows AMD and Intel to contribute to a neutral party. And in that similar sense, CNAR project or Civic Tech here fills that gap as well. If the private sector is unable to provide a good service, or the government isn't able to provide a good service, who provides this neutral ground to put in enough resources to develop and fill in these gaps? So, yeah, hopefully that's a good example of what's the role of civil society in tech. Yeah.
So any other question we will go on? If not, okay. So what is the scope of thing that CNAR project is focusing on?
What we've usually now focused basically is we're tech, right? So we don't want to overlap with the traditional NGOs. So we're not that good with doing things like policy, or we don't do protests on the streets, or make press statements or whatever. Those are kind of legal policy and so on. Those are the roles of the more traditional NGOs. Where CNAR comes in is the fact that government and public services is moving to a digital space. So very few people, for example, if you want to look up something or you want to find out about a service, these days it's rare that you'd actually go to a government office. The first thing that you would do is actually Google for it, right? And if you can't find it on Google, you just give up. And so these days, the scope of CNR projects is actually to work on how to improve the environment for how digital government can provide digital services better. And where the government doesn't provide those digital services, we step in and temporarily fill in that gap. Yeah.
So what kind of services you're talking about here?
Well, here's an example of the one that Michael is working on, which is parliamentary documents, right? So if you go to the parliamentary website, I don't know, it's probably on Drupal 1.0 or something. It's the site's just, I mean, they put a new skin on it, but it's really basic. You can't search for anything. God knows the document browsing feature on it is some JavaScript from I don't know when with a little hierarchy that doesn't scale, right? So in this case, for example, it's not providing the services that people want. So for example, I want to find out who's my legislative person or what did they say in Parliament. You can't just go to the government site and just search. So for us here, so since they can't do it for a lot of different reasons that we can go on that later, we as tech people or civic tech can provide that stopgap measure, right? So so what we did, for example, was simply put it up on a CMS, back it up with full text indexing for Elasticsearch. Michael wrote the scripts to split the questions into singular documents, and just basically now enable full text search for all the documents on the parliamentary website. Just that very simple thing of full text search, which most of you think for the tech audience out there, that's pretty straightforward. Because they aren't able to do it, we step in there and provide this public service.
Okay, I'm thinking of basic question right now. Justin, anything you want to add on that before go on?
No, I'd like
okay,
to.
so here's the thing, right?
Yeah.
Go on.
Yeah, I wanted to continue on the line of the full-time work, part-time work. Like, how much time do you devote to volunteer work?
So for me, so for CNR, I was mentioning that example of the USB IF part, right? This is why we need a civil society organization in tech. It's not something you can do on a volunteer time. Yeah. So for me, for example, it's a full-time job. And ideally, I would have 3 or 4 people. So for example, like the Linux Foundation, I think they've got like a staff of like 30 people or so. Because some of the problems that I might share later on the show are actually really hard. Like some of the technical. Okay, an example would be of a really hard full-time job, which seems simple, is how do I reform procurement for IT services, right? That is not as easy an answer as we should just hire better people. What's the criteria? What's the process? Is there a lack of competition in this area? Yeah. So
just buy cheaper computer.
Yeah. So there's certain things that you can do on a volunteer level. Like for example, Paradox is mostly self-running, but if we were really going to provide something that was really good that people really want, those things require full-time resources. Yep.
And how do you know that people actually appreciate what it is that you're doing?
Well, you'll see in terms of the usage in the news, for example. So I'll just give an example in terms of I think right now there's a huge, global issue on Black Lives Matter and so on, right? So suddenly now people are also asking questions like, are there deaths in custody in Malaysia, for example, right? Where do I find out such information? So strangely enough, one of the few places you can get the statistics is actually in the parliamentary documents. So when people are looking if people wanted to search, for example, on deaths in custody in Malaysia, one of the few sources for official information and data on that is actually on parliamentary documents. So you'll see
Is
it
that,
cited in newspapers.
That's a report to Parliament, basically, something like that.
Yeah, or like a question. So somebody asked,
Mhm.
an MP asked, probably because of one of their, constituents were interested in it, asked, how many people died since 2010, and the government provided an answer to that and actually broke down like how many deaths in custody, or they'll ask other similar related things like were any police officers actually charged right in Malaysia. So yeah,
Sounds
so
like
I mean,
sounds like a good argument to talk to your representatives to get them to ask the questions that you want answered, right?
yes. So if you're an
Apparently
IT,
the answers are
yeah.
there.
So this is actually a really good part about civic tech is that you should ask your MPs for certain things like why is the website so bad, right? So your MP might not be a technical person, but if they post that question, the government has to scramble in 2 weeks and find answers for that. So yeah, so one thing that we have found lacking is a lack of us as either technologists as individuals doing that process. It tends to be done by a lot of the big corporations and so on. But yeah, so you just gave a good example where you actually have some power as a citizen to ask these kind of questions, like why did this cost so much? You can actually ask those questions, and they have to provide answers.
But here's the
Swimming?
thing, right? Sometimes our system is not, I would say, to make it mildly, not perfect. Not perfect.
Yeah.
Okay, we faced this before. Some of our MP, who our MP, not many people know. Not a popular topic. It goes back to Tristan's question. If it's not really important or popular, so it's one of those things that are not popular, and some of them are non-responsive, not active, yada. So why do we still do this, right? It's not the most popular thing, and it's actually very hard to do.
Well, I think Obama made a really good argument for this, right? So people were, so a lot of at one time people were complaining, why can't you deliver things as well as Google, for example, or why can't you deliver as well as Microsoft? Why is the government so bad? And we should have less funding for the government and responsive. And his answer was actually really good. So he's saying that all of the staff at all these tech companies were educated in public schools, most likely, probably drive on roads that are built by government, is trading on a financial system that's managed by the federal bank, and is able to conduct business, including health and so on, getting electricity delivered cheaply through government. So it's kind of in the background, but all these things are actually really important. So if you think about it, about making a better environment for yourself, so if you're often complaining about, man, my internet is so slow, well, because of a lot of us bitching to politicians, they reduce the price of it, right? So this is why it's important to actually get involved, because for a lot of the things that you feel that you are not able to control, government policies are the one that can actually make a difference for your life.
Right.
So yeah.
Okay, cool. Any question to end on top of that? If not, I'll move on.
Sure. No worries.
So out of the work for Sina project is around the parliamentary issue, or the scope actually a bit bigger?
It's bigger because we're the only civic tech group in Malaysia. And that's we can go on the history of constraints on civil society in Malaysia. So the scope in CNR is bigger because we don't have civil society. Ideally, in a healthy environment, like I mentioned, you would let's say San Francisco. That's a good example because tech people are kind of familiar with Silicon Valley. Code for all San Francisco, just by itself, which is Civic Tech for San Francisco, has 4,000 members, right? And they attend. They have a weekly meetup, and they've got an entire office block sponsored by Microsoft, and that's just the Civic Tech side. On top of that, they have things like EFF there to deal with digital rights. They have Sunlight Foundation to deal with government. So technically, in most other countries, you might have 30 to 40 different NGOs doing a lot of different things. Some boring, some interesting, some controversial, some not. But in Malaysia, our scope, sadly, is pretty much everything that's related with tech and the delivery of government services. So as a result, as much as we can, we deal with things like procurement. We deal with things like asset declaration, for example. So asset declaration is pretty interesting. That was quite a political hot topic because we were saying that politicians should deliver asset declaration. We actually, in the roundtables, we actually put the comment that if you're going to publish asset declaration, that it should be in a data readable format, like a spreadsheet, and it should be available online. So those are the kind of things that we get involved as well. If you don't do that, I'll give a funny case of what they did in Hong Kong. So Hong Kong has a brilliant asset declaration law. They declare everything. I think it's a similar case in Taiwan. But because there was no specification that it must be online and in open data format, they just uploaded a whole bunch of PDFs, badly scanned one as well, just to make it harder for you to access them, right? So we deal with the policy aspects. And the other part that we were going to talk a little bit later on this show was we also get involved in terms of defining standards as well. So what would be a good asset declaration standard if it was done as a technical data standard, for example? What would that look like? What fields do you need? Should it be published in JSON? Should it be published in XML? God, no. but yeah, so those are the kind of things that we are also get involved in as well. And we do what we can. And on another point on that scope, just before we go to the next topic, is we're also one of the few civic tech in the region, actually. Because of that, we also tend to be the ones providing input into international standards as well.
Right. So let's go. Okay, because we are technical focused channel. What kind of technically what you guys work? What you guys use? Okay, data standard. How is that useful to that?
Okay. So I just gave that horror story. It's like when we're working with data standards, we don't want XML. We definitely do not want SOAP or anything crazy like that, right? So what's interesting is that a lot of the kind of open data standards and civic tech people actually come from the open source world. So you'll find it quite interesting, the fact that most of the kind of data standards are these days, at least the modern standards, are all kind of developed by techies like us. So they're mostly all in JSON schema format, for example. They're also lightweight, and most of them also have the schemas, in a testable format as well, so that you can run unit tests and so on for compliance. So while there's a policy level to it, there's a lot of, in terms of tech, in terms of open data standards, we're all techies, so we work on the standards that we need to use, which is right now mostly JSON schema.
What stack do you use? I think that's the interesting questions.
The tech,
and
okay,
how large are your data sets?
Okay. For CNAR, for CNAR, most of our data sets it's not that big. I think in total we probably have about 1.7 terabytes or something of documents and text.
That's documents at rest, not the documents that you ingest and then preserve,
Yeah, I
or
mean
is that
it's
different?
no, that's in total. It's the documents plus the
Ah,
metadata,
mhm,
plus the full text indexing as well of this.
mhm.
We try to be mostly tech agnostic, and that's the reason why I prefer working in standards. The reason for that is if you work on a standard, it doesn't matter what kind of tech you build it on. Um, and part of working on JSON schema standards is that you can interoperate between each other, right? So somebody might want to build their, let's say somebody wants to build their procurement tech on PHP if they feel like it. If they're using that same standard and the API exports the data in that format, somebody can build another app, let's say in JavaScript using, I don't know, React or something like that. So at CNR, at least we try to be tech agnostic. um,
Mhm.
we're a Python shop mostly because of legacy issues. It's funny that we were
Has
just.
the
Mhm.
sorry, has the
Yeah.
government ever tried to source information back from you? Because the government is the source of your data, and then have they ever used data that you've cooked
Yeah.
back so that they can use it?
So actually, quite a lot of the MPs, quite a lot of their assistants to MPs are actually using our parliamentary documents. So you'll
Mm,
see now and then that they'll actually cite our site because it's easier.
mhm.
So if I'm an MP and I want to know what I said last year on something, it's easier to use our site than actually the government site, right?
Yeah.
Um, and what's that in terms of government using it? Yeah, one thing I heard was once that some of the parliamentary researchers themselves were using our site because it was easier to search for documents there than
Yeah.
their own system, right? So,
Yeah.
but mostly our interaction with government is what I mentioned before in terms of providing feedback in terms how they can improve certain things.
I see.
So like I
And
said. Mhm.
being an example, like, okay, we're
Mhm.
like, these are the standards, we're implementing them, see how
Yeah,
easy it is to search for data because we are
yeah,
implementing standards.
yeah.
Hmm.
Or the approach that I go these days often is like everybody else is doing it. Let's say, for example, this is the international standard. Let's say so for procurement, for example, there's an international standard called open contracting,
Hmm.
and for open contracting, pretty much every government in the world is now adopting it. So what that also means is that if the Malaysian government doesn't adopt this open standard, then our systems are not going to work for international trade, for example. Um, so we're going to be running different systems, or a feature that, let's say, the WTO requests that Malaysian procurement has. If we're not implementing the standard, we might be missing some data or technical specification that we can't provide. Um, so yeah, so my approach for government is like one is that it provides better efficiency, but it's just like these days you don't want to build a device that's not USB-C, for example, right? Yeah,
Hmm.
it's just not beneficial. So it's the same thing with the data standards. If we don't adopt them, we can't see the innovations, right? So imagine if you had some horrible proprietary XML SOAP specification for procurement, right? And then you go and approach tech people and say, "Let's work on this." Like they're all just going to leave the room, right? So,
Yeah.
so in terms of enabling innovations, we need them to adopt these standards as well. Things
We
that we
have a
can actually
question
use.
from Jern,
Yep.
from YouTube.
Yep.
Has the government ever tried to stop or block any of your work? Like a
Um,
controversial question. Are
not
you allowed
direct.
to answer this?
Yeah, not directly actually. Like I said to you before, we're technical, and we're
Hmm.
political, so we actually have a good relationship quite often with the civil servants, because in the end I think one civil servant mentioned this to me, is that in the end we all want a better place to live in. So when we're talking about these sort of things like better schools or better hospitals, it's not really controversial. So no, strangely, even at the time of say 1MDB and websites being banned and so on, we actually had continued engagement with the government because, like, what's controversial about a JSON schema standard?
Well,
And
well, that's just those are the standards, but you also host the data, right?
Yeah.
And
and
there is emanation of authority, being that
Yeah.
you say this is the data, even though you're not the primary source of the
Yeah.
data.
So that's another interesting thing. We actually only have government data at the moment. So everything that's actually on CNAR is actually publicly available information. It's just more accessible. So you can't go and say we're gonna block something that's publicly available. So actually this has come up before. We don't do leaks at CNAR Project because we're an open government organization. So whatever we have is official government documentation. So no, we haven't been blocked directly, but we have had a case where we've seen the impact of our transparency work lead to less data being available. So a good example for this was the construction database, which Swimming scrape, and also Chi Liang, he also helped scrape it. So in the original data sets that we scraped, so just
I
for...
don't know anything about CNAR project.
Okay, yes. So he didn't do it. It was his friend. So the construction database in Malaysia is actually a database, what used to be a public database of every construction project in Malaysia. So whether you're renovating your house, for example, or a new shopping mall is going to be built around the corner, each one of these projects had to have a registered contractor. Except for the really petty ones, all of them had some sort of registration that, we built an extension here, or we built a shopping mall, or we built a bus stop, right? So in 2012, we found out that they actually had all of this public in a scrapable format online. And most interestingly, of course, was that they also included the directors of all the companies that got the contracts. So the 2012 data set that we scraped showed a whole bunch of politicians who had companies that were given contracts, right? So that actually never got blocked. Mostly, again, like we said, we're not really an advocacy group. We put the data out there, but we didn't actually, make, controversial statements about it or not. But what we did find out was that 3 years later, when we scraped it again, most of the politicians' names or any high-profile people's names were no longer in the database. So we had more contracts, but less people. So so we've never actually had a block, but we've seen situations where greater access leads to less data being actually available for others. Yeah.
How about like the
And how about
database? Just the website change or the data?
The CIDB website or the construction?
CIA, the environmental impact.
Okay, yeah. So interestingly enough, for a lot of the government websites, it's not really censorship or anything like that. What tends to happen is this: somebody comes in and says, "I'm going to build a new website," and they build the website, but they don't migrate any of the old content, right? So then a whole bunch of links go offline. So that's a perfect and this is this is something that really bugs me. Why governments somehow don't know how to do URL redirection or subdomains? A good example for this is the MOF budget. So when they announce, what is it, the latest stimulus package for the COVID-19, they just, instead of creating a subdomain for that little special announcement, they just basically took off the main website of the finance ministry, and basically every detail on budgets or whatever you needed to find on the Ministry of Finance website became some subdomain of MOF or something like that, and data disappears. So most often than not, it's not really censorship. It's just pure, like, oh, screw this. I want to have
Information
a
management.
new. Yeah, I want a better theme on this website, and screw all the old URLs. We're just gonna not make it work anymore. And that led us to having GovDocs, which is the main archive website, which was basically to store all these links before they disappeared, basically. Yeah. Michael mentioned the EIA. The Department of Environment is actually one of the better departments in terms of transparency. So they went through a period of having the EIAs, then shifting it to some subdomain which we couldn't access, to now putting it all back online again. So yeah. So not so much censorship as in my experience is that just bad information management, basically. Who cares about legacy documents, right?
Tristan, you're asking something just now?
No. I just wanted to continue on with the
Yeah.
technology questions. Like you mentioned, 1.7 terabytes.
Yeah.
Where is it being stored, and how secure is it? And what if that place gets
It's cluttered.
raided or ransacked?
Yeah.
Do you have
Yeah.
backups and all of these things?
Yes. So everything's held by duct tape. That's our project. We did. But we're not that horrible in tech. So for us, we had to consider a budget. That's one thing, right? So one of the things that when we had the tech infrastructure was, could it run with no budget, basically, right? So how do you keep several terabytes of storage online with no money, right?
You
Or with-
upload it as a torrent. That's what they
Yeah.
do.
But we ran into problems with that in the sense that you can't have a searchable database of torrents unless you have that full text index somewhere. It's hard to build live applications, if you have these kind of distributed things. So one option, of course, is putting it on AWS or something like that. So that's one option. But we have a pretty strange use case, right? Maybe we should do that for during this question. So we had this weird use case of where hardly very low traffic, right? So in the sense that very low but important traffic. So there might only be, let's say, 500 requests a month, right? But those 500 requests are, from lawyers or parliamentarians and so on. So there's not many requests, but they need it. Now but at the same time, we have a whole ton of data, right? Like over 1.7 terabytes and growing. So if you do your normal cloud things for storage, it actually ends up being quite expensive because you just have an always on storage of 1.7 terabytes that nobody actually uses. So scaling for that was quite problematic. And if you put it on Glacier, you have that same problem of, like, say, torrent. It's like, it takes a few minutes before you can get access to that, and then your app times out or whatever it is while it's pulling that data out. So our tech setup is a mixture of advanced and low tech blockchain. So what we do is that we have a ZFS storage archive at the office, running off free NAS and also one of our servers. Why ZFS? It's just easy to manage a whole bunch of different VMs. I don't know. It's really easy to manage like terabytes of information, and it's really easy to manage all the different VMs. And what Jering just mentioned just now, it also allows us to have replicability. So, for example, I can easily mirror the ZFS images or Z volumes that we have of the VMs in the office to my FreeBSD server at home, because ZFS has this option of snapshots where I can actually do an SSH rsync of only the block changes for a VM. So technically, I can do a block by block level synchronization of a VM image through ZFS. So that's our storage. So it's relatively easy to, for example, since there's not much updates on the data, it's relatively easy for us to keep in sync, or in my case, to keep offsite backups of the main storage of the key VMs that we have. So that's the storage and distribution part. So if Jung has a terabyte spare somewhere on ZFS, he can help us mirror some of that through an SSH and ZFS script. So our next problem is that so it's not on the cloud as 1.7 terabytes. It could be costly to put on, say, Google Drive for storage. So what we do is, and it comes back to this idea of what happens if it's raided, or what happens if there's a fire at the office, and how do you keep something online with no budget? So what we actually do is we actually have a VPN in one of our Linode services, and then each VM that we have for the services actually connects to the Linode VPN, and then we just do an HA proxy on the Linode to connect to the VPNs wherever they are. So technically, as long as we can keep one VPN hosting up, we can actually host any of the CNAR project websites or VMs on any connection. So all we need to do, let's just say I've got a mirror of the VM at my at home. All I have to do is spin it up at my home, and as long as, and because it's automatically connects to the VPN, if the office is shut down, then the public would never know which VPN client it's going to be connecting to. It could be run out of anybody's houses technically, as long as you're willing to keep. So I think GovDocs, it'll be a little bit slow, but I think I could probably run it off a USB drive, off a Raspberry 4 Pi or something. Maybe not, because I don't think it can handle the VM. But yeah, you get the gist. As long as the VM runs on somebody's laptop somewhere and it's got an internet connection, our services will continue running. I actually had an article on that. Yeah. Actually, this is
before.
No, I'm just going to go back. This is actually a good way for startups, actually, if you think about it, right? So if you wanted to do something that's really heavy, let's say video editing, right? And you can't afford to pay for the video processing power of your app, or your, something that you want to demo to an investor, right? You could technically have that on your, home PC with your GPU, for example. And you just have, the cheapest Linode or hosting service that you can have, and just connect it to a VPN. That way, as long as you have some sort of caching available, you can have a site always up and running for $10 or like 20 ringgit a month or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Right. So before I go on, do you have anything to show to us actually?
Yeah. So I just want to show example of open data standards, because it's something that I kind of wanted to get more help from the technical side. Mostly because it's not as yeah. So yeah.
Can I show the screen now?
Yeah. So I'll show. Yeah, you can show the screen, right?
Yeah.
So.
Okay.
Yeah, that's okay. I might share a different screen. Hold on.
Yeah.
It's okay. I'm just going to use.
Please make it safe.
Yeah.
Please make it family friendly.
Can you zoom in a bit?
Yeah, I'm actually going to share a different screen. Hold on. Share.
It doesn't matter, but make it family friendly and make it larger.
It's friendly.
Yes. We are family friendly. Just kidding.
Just wondering if
I didn't even curse today.
Okay, so
while you're doing that, okay, never mind. You're already done.
Yeah. So this is my often go-to slide on why kind of open data standards matter. So a common situation is that you have pieces of information, like government information, and they're incomplete and they're random, right? So one example for this is, I think for COVID response, right? We want to give help to, or the government needs to transfer cash or aid to the people that need it the most, right? The problem quite often is that, well, who has that data? Well, the welfare department has it. Schools have it. Some NGOs might have it. IRB, the tax department, might have it. Some other agency, let's say the credit rating, might also have some other data as well. So it's really hard to piece these things together into something workable that you can analyze if you don't have a consistent standard, right? So this is a common case when there's just random pieces of information. Another example for when there's a problem with open data standards is they wanted to check on employment, but the list of categories for jobs from one department differs from another. So if you're a Uber driver, are you in the same category as a driver, as in a driver, or a bus driver? So these kind of things are really hard when it's incomplete and in different places. Another common problem that you're working for data analysis, especially with government, is that there's a lot of data. It's confusing, it's inconsistent. There's no, because sometimes the dates are in US format, sometimes it's in ISO format, and sometimes they just don't have enough data and things are bits and missing. If you ever worked with government data, you know how it is. So that's the other problem that we have, right? So at least, if we have a structured data of what it should look like, right? So it's the same thing. If I'm going to connect a USB-C audio to a USB-C device, it makes it a lot easier if I know what kind of wiring I need to do. So even if you don't have the complete information, right, you'd at least have a rough idea how it could look like, right? So even though I'm missing, like 4 pieces out of 6, at least now I know I can go to somebody and says, I need 1, or I'm missing 4. Whereas before I didn't have that clear understanding of it, right? So either we know what is missing to build our app or to do our data analysis, or it gives us a clear idea of what we need to have or what the government is missing. And yeah, finally, of course, if you have the complete picture, you can piece it together, right? So this is the example I usually give. It becomes very clear who it is and what you need to find out. So I'm just going to switch screens, for example, of an example of open ownership. So hold on, gotta stop screen, share. Okay. So these things are a lot more complicated than it is. So I'm just going to give this example of an open data standard. So this is done by a journalist. I think it's done by the Itch, if I'm not mistaken.
I think we need to share the screen. Or
is it shared?
Swimming, you might have to. Yeah. No, someone needs to show it up. Yeah. Okay.
Okay, so I'm gonna screen this through, right? So maybe I'm just gonna zoom out a bit. Okay, so this is an example of a beneficial ownership issue, like who owns which companies, right? And I'm just gonna zoom in so that you get to see a little bit. So you'll see that this guy, some tycoon, he owns this company, and that company owns a sub company, and that own company is sub company who owns another company over here, who owns a 50% share in that, split into 50%, who then owns this, who then knows this person, and so on, right? So you get it's like a, and then owns 3.2%, and so on. So in order to implement this as data is surprisingly a lot harder than I thought it was, right? So so this is the part where having an open data standard helps. So it doesn't. So this kind of data set is not just related to transparency and corruption. If you're working for a bank, for example, all risk analysis for a department for a bank they either do it manually or they're going to have to do this sort of things before they approve, let's say, a $30 million loan to build a building or something. So one example of this standard, so in this case, it's like, okay, I'm a tech guy, and let's just say I have no knowledge of this world of, open ownership and beneficial ownership and who owns what company and so on. How can and I'm working at let's say a risk analysis department, and they say, okay, I need to make a risk analysis and estimate of whether this company has any connections to any bad people, right? Or companies that are, how would I build this database? Or like, can you build this for me, right? Now, if you were going to try to do it on your own from scratch, you're going to be repeating the same problems as a whole lot of different people who have probably tried it for 5 years, right? So my approach for these sort of things is like, okay, is there an international standard for this that I can learn and adopt from? And in this case, for beneficial ownership, there's actually a standard called open ownership. And so here's an example of the model, right? So a lot of people, including experts, from enforcement agencies, from company registrars, similar to SSM in the UK, in the US, people working for OECD or the World Bank, they've gone through and had a lot of discussions on how can we map this, and then how can we map it technically, right? So what they've come up with is the fact that you need to have these sort of data pieces called statements, right? I'm not going to go through all the technical specifications of it, but this just gives an example of why even simple fields like this and how you would model such a tool. It's good to actually refer to international standards for these things, and part of it is the fact that if it's a domain area that you're not that familiar with, it's hard to do it. And I'm just going to go an example here is the fact that let's just go through to actually how the data actually looks, right? So now when I'm actually going to implement it in terms of the schema reference, so I'm going to build a beneficial ownership risk analysis tool for my finance team, for example. Well, then you can actually just go to the standard, and you'll notice that it actually has the schema there for you, including descriptions of what is needed for each, like how should a country be done, how should the entity statement should be, and I think there's actually downloadable versions of the schema. So yeah, if you're going to build this, you don't have to build it from scratch. You can actually find the standards for these sort of things, and now you've got a pretty good base for building this app for risk analysis for your finance team. The other thing that I would like to hint on, the reason why I kind of came on to DevKami is that understanding this data or data structure, looks absolutely normal for us, right? It's just date statements, strings, dates, booleans, required or not required. Is it an object? Is it an array? These kind of data structures is just, for us, it's totally common for tech people like us. If we see this reference, we can implement it in pretty much, whether you're a database person or you're a NoSQL person or you're a JavaScript person. As tech people, this is straightforward. But the thing that we're kind of lacking right now is the tech people who can translate this to, say, talk to the person from risk analysis and explain to them, what do you need and how would it look like as a JSON schema format, for example. Or you have to go back to them and say, well, if you want to do this risk analysis tool that you're telling me to develop, I'm going to need this data from your team. So of course, as a tech person, I'm not an expert on risk analysis. So you can actually go and refer to these open data standards and say, okay, and help kind of be the go-between between the tech standards and the practical implementation of how I would build an app, to actually talk to the main policy people or the investigators or the analysts and say, okay, can you tell me what you need that's not in here, or give me a use case. So this is an example where we're lacking people in this field right now, especially in Southeast Asia. So if you're a tech person, thinking about different fields of work, this is another area actually, and that's more and more common these days. So let's just say the government wants to provide, I just gave that example, but I'm just going to repeat it again. The government now needs to have a policy to give welfare aid to the people that need it the most. And you need to build an app for this. What would the data structure needed for that sort of thing? And what would be how would the data structure or the standard look like that can satisfy all the different use cases that they're asking for, right? We've got some school from data. So this is an area that we need more tech people to get involved with, because if the standards are bad, you can't build your app. And if you're not familiar with the standards, you're going to be reinventing the wheel. And a pretty sad use case is actually CNAP project. We actually tried to build kind of like an MP website for all the context or for all elected representatives and to store organizations. We failed like 2 or 3 times because every time we built our app, we started learning problems at each go. But once we adopted an international standard, it was pretty fast to roll out our applications because the standard takes the experience of people from like 20 different countries with a variety of data sets. And all we had to do was just implement that. And we knew that we could cover like 40 sets. It's like kind of like, using an open source tool that's developed by 500 developers versus rolling your own tool and try to make it better than what they've done. Right. So, yeah.
That's kind of a tall order, though, to get people like that who have domain knowledge as well as understanding technology, because that's like that. Those are basically the requirements in order to provide housing. You have to know what the problems are in housing and also understand the standards.
Yes.
So that's quite difficult.
Yeah. So, and because it's so difficult and because there's not many people, I would actually encourage, more tech people to look into these fields because it's a niche, right? So if you go out onto, let's say, the job market and say, hey, I know Node.js, there's going to be like 2,000 people with that, right? But if you go into that in a niche and say, okay, I've worked with housing, for example, and I've worked with and I've also know tech, so I can implement the JSON schema that the developer is going to need to actually do housing really well. That's going to be a pretty, like you said, it's going to be a rare niche, but I also shared before that this is where government is going to go. So if you think of every single case of where a government service needs to go to digital, there's going to be a niche for this kind of people. And it's going to be a very important niche because if you do a bad standard, it's going to be bad for everybody. So just imagine the government is going to collect data for urban housing, for example, and does it wrong, right? And it's missing the data. It's just going to be bad for everybody. Yeah. So, yeah. So, yes, it's hard.
It is difficult. And it's also a good argument for doing volunteer work, because otherwise you're not going to be exposed to these kinds of problems. If you go volunteer for a feeding program, then you get exposed to logistics, like what is enough for a person, how much do they eat, why were these portions of food chosen, how were they distributed, what kinds of food were there, the logistics of manpower, which portions, which ones do you serve first. So all of these you're not going to be exposed in your normal tech job, but volunteering you actually get exposed, and then that gives you ideas. Okay, this is how they solve it. How can technology help it?
And this is the and this is the shortage now, right? The shortage of like, how can that person? So these people, they know all their things, like food portions and where's the number of people, right? But they don't know how to translate that into, let's say, a technical standard to build an app for them, right? So you can't just
Yeah.
build an app. You got to know both. So yeah. So there's going to be a case for this. It can be volunteer, but if you're in a big corporation, it can just be talking to different people in different teams. So I just mentioned that risk analysis is something that most large corporations have. So it might be actually just worth going downstairs and talking to that team and say, hey, I'm
Yeah.
curious.
Talk to
how do
your
you-
accountants or your finance people.
Yeah, or
Don't just talk
risk-
to people because they are cute.
yeah.
Talk to them because they know stuff.
or or your legal department, or
Yes.
Yeah.
or even your salesperson. So this kind of skills would do you well. But coming back to, Jern just shared that this is a standard business role, but right now we're lacking for this kind of skills in the government space and also in the civil society space. So sometimes it might be volunteering, but we need more people to do that, including the government side. And it's good to start now, because eventually every single field that you can think of in terms of government service are going to need these skill sets that I just shared.
In fact, one of those things that we've been saying, that do not just focus on just pure technical skill, because the business skill, the business knowledge have been good. It's something that we say early on. Build up your understanding of a business area you want to go in. In my case, it's civic tech because that's what I'm familiar with. But know something that is not just technology. Often, a lot of the startups around the world keep telling us, disrupt. But how about this? Learn about your business and how it goes, then figure out how to be better, right? Don't just, because often we had a new fantasy among the startup world where you know nothing, you're proud of it, and you go in and disrupt, then you end up like Grab. Except nowadays, Grab is a taxi company, right?
Yeah.
Taxi company with an app. So now you
And
have no problem.
now a delivery logistics company, apparently. So they
And-
started because it
Yes.
was in the beginning it was moving people, now they're moving stuff around.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's like
So
that's
it's a
different.
transportation company.
Yeah.
So they didn't change that much. They just had an app. So
Mhm.
so
Yeah,
much
I
for
mean,
disruption, right?
I'll give Nick. I was actually on another panel where I was on somebody at a person from Maybank, I think, for doing data analysis, right? So he
Yep.
gave another comment. So this is good for those of you guys who want to go into, let's say, the big data field or data analytics field. What he commented was on that panel was that he said, I can easily hire on JobStreet people with data scientists or data analysis skills, right? So he was saying that they know all the tools, they know R, they know Python, they know Pandas. They know all the tools for dealing with data analysis and data science. But he said that so he says, I can find thousands of this if I do a job opening in JobStreet. What he said, what he needed for his team was somebody who can look at the data and know what sort of problems they need to find in that data,
Yes.
and what kind of problems that they need to solve with that data. So that was the problem that he had in terms of hiring. So so you need to go and learn another field beyond just the tools that that you need to do certain things. That's the value. If you want to separate yourself from the other 3,000 job seekers out there.
Guten said that tools is easy. I know it's one of my not so popular opinion. Focus on your non-core hardcore tech skill. But what do I know? I only have robots and toys.
But it's the same thing with the tools.
I-
If you know the tools at a basic level, everybody knows the tools at the basic level. So if you want to focus on the tool, you better be the expert on that tool if you want to separate yourself from the other 2,000 people who know that tool. So yeah,
Mhm.
I'm not a
When you
very
go to
smart
corporate.
person.
Yeah, so we're almost
Yeah.
we're almost
Yeah.
ending. So I wanted to ask
Yeah.
like a question: how do you export CNR project to other countries, other regions?
Yeah. So for us, it's basically the adoption of
fault.
the. Yeah. So for us, it's like basically that international data standard thing, right? So, so one is the fact that we're adopting something that should be workable in a lot of other countries because it's tested in say 20 or 30 different cases. The other part that why we do projects, let's say in Kenya or even in Myanmar, as another example, is the fact that we're more familiar with an environment where it's not the U.S. or Europe. So for us, the use cases for us is like, how can we do this in an environment where there's no data or the data is messy? And we've been able to kind of share that experiences with other countries with that, a strong civic tech team. And tell them, it's like, hey, cool, no, we know exactly your situation in Myanmar. No data, no this, or bad data, and so on. And we're saying like, okay, so how we share experiences that, okay, this is what we've got, what we've learned following international data standards in Malaysia with no data, and these are the ways that we work with it, right? Like building an app where five fields are missing, for example.
So I'm going to give, because I used to be senior project, I'm going to give a good summary. Essentially, Malaysia politically is similar to these so-called South Asian countries and a lot of these, but yet we are not the most. We don't live on trees. We have technologies. For goodness sake, Malaysia use MacBooks, for goodness sake, right? So we have internet. So we are technically competent. Yet Sina project is different in the way they will also understand policy level issue. So we understand the corruption issue as well. So we can talk to all these little countries, but we have the technical competency to implement and understand what they need. So it's a good mix of these two actually.
Yeah. So,
and we're also lucky to be discovered by international organization.
And another interesting thing is that Malaysia is not as bad an authoritarian country as people think it is. Yes. So we have a lot more freedom for these sort of things than say Singapore, right? So we can have a meetup of 20 people to discuss about civic tech issues, policies, shortcomings in government policies, and it's not a controversial thing. And to come back to what the civil service shared with me, is that we're all in this together to make a better country. So nobody's actually going to be against you for doing that sort of thing. We have the tech, and generally we also have quite an educated population that's interested in fixing things around where they live. And so it doesn't always have to be like anti-corruption. It could just be as simple as like, can we have better bus stops everywhere, right? So those are surprisingly hard problems that that we need to that we can fix in Malaysia.
Any other extra thing you want to ask before we have to close this?
How about Michael? Do we specify?
How are you funded, and are you a CIA agent?
Okay. That's it. Actually, we're fully transparent, so you can actually go to CNR About Us and you see how much funding that we've got. So for us, sadly enough, I would say like 98% of our funding is actually by foreign governments, and not the CIA kind. They're people funding us. Yeah. So generally, the people that are funding us tend to be kind of research government agencies, right? So for last year, for example, we were mostly funded by the Canadian government. And the reason for this was to kind of work on these standards so that they can be reused in other developing countries. So a lot of it was not specific for Malaysia, but actually for, so most of the Malaysian work is actually on volunteer funded, but the bulk of the funding is from the foreign government. Yeah.
So that means if someone wants to go full-time with CNR project, it doesn't mean that they don't get anything. They're not compensated because there's funding.
No, yeah. So, yes. So, yeah, like I shared to you, this is, like you shared to us, this is a hard problem. It is a niche. So there is demand for it. So if you want to go with CNR, first of all, you kind of going to need to understand first, like, how does it work and so on. But if you like this kind of work, we can find funding for it because these are very hard problems. And if you're good at it, you can actually find jobs even internationally for it. So a lot of Malaysians, like they do, if you're really good at this, you're going to end up working at, say, the World Bank or something, because it is a niche. that we need, that more
Yeah.
people need to be in.
That's a great hiring slogan. Work for CNR, work for the World Bank, or
Yeah.
something like that.
Yeah, but the sad part is that, like you said, because it's so hard, the same people that we could possibly hire, you could also be hired by good companies. So it's a challenge for us. More so than the funding is the fact that the same people who can do this can also probably senior people or people who can get hired in. Let's say there's no way I can pay you as much as, let's say, Deloitte or something for risk analysis, but the skill sets are the same. So yeah, there will be if you're interested in this area, there can be funding for full time, but yeah, it'll never match working at, say, Deloitte or some big bank or something like that.
So let's say the guys want to help out in Sina project. Where should the people start?
I would say whatever is just like the tech world. What scratches your itch, right? So I because these things are hard. If it's not an itch you want to scratch, then yeah, you're not going to be able to do it because it's hard. And even if it's a job, you don't want to do it. Like, who wants to look at more JavaScript after a whole day of work, right? So it can be fun in the sense that you can apply, learn different tech. Like, for example, Michael's doing Golang, and now we've got everything on Golang at CR. And now I've got to pick that up too. So it can be a fun playground for different, tech. But generally, the best thing that motivates, to join CNR is like, is it something that scratches your itch? Do you want, cheaper housing, or are you interested in better public transport? And if you have this itch, then, we kind of have the community that we can kind of guide you, not to just do this on the voluntary level, but, to figure out a way of contributing it, as a full-time person as well.
Is the tech intern position still open? And I heard you guys were going to participate in a hackathon, right? So
yeah.
So somewhere there for people to try.
Nobody actually took up that internship. I'm actually going to try get more funding for full-time interns. So I don't know, maybe people didn't understand the idea of internship at CNR, but our idea of internship at CNR was not to make coffee for me or run down to McDonald's to buy lunch. The idea at CNR was to actually build capacity. So usually how we plan our internships is actually for 6 months, where for the first 3 months or so, we're actually planning to train you on all the basics. Like, if you're tech, we will actually bring you up, using source code and JIT and basic networking and so on. And then by the end of the 6 months, we don't always hope that we're able to hire you full time. But if you don't, we're also hoping that you actually have the skill sets that will then allow you to contribute either to other civil society or even in the other jobs that you do. And it's for the roles that we just shared just now, this kind of crossroads. So we had our last Canadian intern, for example, she was from an environmental background. So she learned about, what kind of standards are needed for doing analysis of the environment. Another person came from a pure tech world, and she started learning about, the legal aspects of procurement. And if you don't have tech background, or you're from a let's say a legal background and you want to learn tech, do look out for internships, because if you're really interested, for example, to learn tech from the ground up, and be in an environment where you can apply those skills, like in a practical manner, like, working with ZFS, working with JSON schema standards, look out for these opportunities because they're fully paid. And our internships are at least 1,500 ringgit, because we believe that you should be paid at least more than minimum wage to learn these things. So yeah, do look out for them. We've had a lack of response, so that kind of scares me to look for funding, because if I get the funding confirmed, I have to spend it. But if there's more interest in this kind of internships to learn tech and policy, Do you follow us on social media, because then we'll be doing more announcements, especially if there's more interest in it.
Okay. And that's it. If we have no extra question online and all that, let's call it the day then.
Yeah, cool. Thanks for having me
So-
on. Yeah.
Yeah. Stay a
Yay.
while because we don't actually end our stuff immediately. So with that said,
Okay.
goodbye. See you